I resided in the same house throughout my entire life, from my childhood through high school, and even into most of college. However, during my last year of college, I moved out, and it felt rather peculiar to be in a new place. I decided to rent a tiny single-bedroom house on the opposite side of town. Despite the change in my surroundings, I quite enjoyed it. On the first day, I rented a van and transported all my belongings to the new place. I didn't really bother with unpacking. I simply placed the boxes in the main room and relaxed for the rest of the night. The entire process, from finding the place to dealing with the paperwork, left me feeling drained, and I was relieved to be done with the challenging parts. I set up the TV on a few sturdy crates and began watching a show. It was probably around 7 o'clock, too early for bed. As I sat there, watching with half-open eyes, I started hearing two individuals conversing outside. I lowered the TV volume and strained to listen, but their voices were hushed, and I couldn't discern their conversation. Curious, I went to one of the windows, partially drawing back the curtain. As soon as I did, I noticed a figure quickly moving past it from outside, which startled me. The voices had ceased speaking by now, and I could hear footsteps circling the house. But just as suddenly as they began, the footsteps stopped, and the environment became eerily silent again. I checked a few more windows before returning to the couch and resuming my show. I figured I was simply being overly cautious about living alone in a new environment. I watched TV for a while and eventually lay down as I became drowsy, dozing off around 10 p.m. When I woke up, the house was pitch dark, with the only illumination coming from the TV screen. I checked my phone and saw that it was 2 a.m., so I turned off the TV and prepared to sleep. However, as I was about to close my eyes, I heard a soft creak emanating from the floorboards across the room. I immediately shifted my gaze toward the sound. In the doorway across the hall, I saw a figure staring at me. The person's eyes were wide open and about half of their body was concealed behind the door frame. I locked eyes with them for a few terrifying seconds before they sprinted out of the doorway and down the unlit hallway. Shortly after, another set of footsteps on the other side of the house followed the same direction. After some muffled thuds, silence enveloped the house. The darkness was unsettling, and my heart raced as I felt a strange mix of panic and being frozen in place. After collecting myself, I dialed 911, describing the situation between shaky breaths. While still on the phone with the police, I turned on the lights, and in the hallway, I found scuffed shoe prints going up and down multiple times. Looking back at the living room, I noticed dirty shoe prints all over the carpet, some disturbingly close to where I had been sleeping. When the police arrived, they searched the area, collected samples, but couldn't find concrete evidence. Even more unsettling was their inability to determine how the intruders gained access to the house. I mentioned the thuds I heard as they left, but the windows in that area were still locked. This summer, in late June, I moved from my apartment to a charming little home on the outskirts of my city. I was already familiar with the area and had been eyeing the housing market for a while, hoping to leave my apartment behind and purchase a home. I chose an older house that needed some work, but the price and location were ideal. It was situated about a mile down a road just off the highway, surrounded mostly by trees and greenery, with a few neighboring houses within sight. On the day I moved in, I drove the U-Haul down to the house, and while unloading, I noticed someone observing me. They were standing far off near the tree line, facing me and just watching as I moved in. Although they were quite distant, I didn't perceive any immediate harm, so I found it somewhat eerie but not overly concerning. I eventually got caught up in the moving process and focused on getting everything inside the house before it got dark. By around 6 p.m. I had finished, and as the sun began to set, I locked up the back of the U-Haul truck, got in, and drove it back to the rental shop. During this drive, I had a strange gut feeling that something was amiss with that person watching me, and perhaps they weren't entirely innocent. Upon returning to my new house in an Uber, I kept an eye out for the individual but couldn't spot them. I entered the house, turned on the lights, and felt overwhelmed by the numerous boxes and pieces of furniture scattered throughout. By around 6:30 p.m., I had dinner and began the task of unpacking and organizing my belongings. I spent the entire night sorting out what needed to go into storage and what needed to be unpacked. After organizing my boxes for storage, I ventured into the attic, using the ladder to access it. Once I had placed one of the boxes up there, I went back down, picked up another box in the kitchen, and made my way toward the stairs. As I approached the staircase with the second box, I heard the sound of metal shaking coming from the upstairs hallway. It was the distinct noise of someone descending the ladder. I looked up the stairs, and moments later a man appeared at the top, peering down at me. He sprinted down the stairs at full speed as I rushed towards the front door. I could hear his footsteps approaching rapidly from behind as I reached my car, jumped in, and locked the doors. He slammed against the car, trying to open it but failed. After a few attempts, he punched the window a couple of times and then ran towards the tree line. Terrified, I called the police immediately. The authorities didn't find much evidence, but they suspected the intruder might have stayed in the attic for a few days, as they discovered some blankets up there. I'll never know the full truth, but the fact that I was in the attic while he was hiding somewhere in the dark just a few feet away terrifies me. He chased me afterward, and I'm convinced he wasn't a harmless individual. I shudder to think about what might have happened if he had caught me. I went through a rather peculiar phase in my life where I found myself without a stable place to live and wasn't earning enough money to secure my own accommodation. My situation arose right after college, and I was running out of time to move out of the dorms. Unfortunately, most of my friends from school were either returning to their parents' homes or leaving town, which left me in a challenging predicament. My solution was to search for an affordable place and find a roommate to share the expenses with. As the deadline for moving out approached, I came across a rental listing on a website. The ad was posted by an individual named Xander, who was looking for a roommate to move into his rented house. The house appeared relatively small, which gave me hope that it might be budget-friendly. I responded to the ad, and shortly after, Xander called me. We arranged a tour, discussed the rent, and I decided to move in. Despite the urgency of my situation, I didn't initially view it as a bad arrangement. Xander and I got along well, and since we had both recently graduated, we shared a similar outlook on life. Having a friend in a similar position was actually quite refreshing. However, the house itself wasn't ideal. It had only one bedroom, so I ended up using the living room as my sleeping quarters. It wasn't perfect, but it was better than being homeless, and I spent most of my time working. About a week after settling in, something unsettling occurred. In the middle of the night, as I was sleeping in the living room, I heard the front door creak open. I looked up to see Xander entering the house. He glanced in my direction, but seemingly didn't realize I was awake. He passed by me and headed down the hall to his room. I could hear him moving things around in his room, but he soon returned to the front door. This time, he stopped and turned to look at me, standing in the living room for 5 to 10 seconds before going back outside. The way he acted left me feeling incredibly uneasy. A few minutes later, I heard more movement near the front door. When it opened again, I pretended to be asleep to avoid drawing attention. Xander entered, shut the door, and walked down the hallway, audibly breathing heavily. When he reached the end of the hall, I cautiously opened my eyes a crack, catching a glimpse of him holding what appeared to be a lifeless body in his arms. He hurried into his room and closed the door. I was in such shock that I questioned the reality of what I had just witnessed. I considered various possibilities, like Xander having encountered a drunken person who needed a place to sleep after a night of partying. Nevertheless, I decided to approach Xander's room quietly to listen to what was happening inside. As I listened to his continuous movements, my growing concern overcame me. I mustered the courage to knock on his door. All movement ceased abruptly, followed by several seconds of eerie silence before he approached the door. I heard the lock click, and then he opened the door just a crack, revealing a fraction of his face. He apologized for waking me and claimed he was merely rearranging some items. Suspicious, I directly inquired about the lifeless body I had seen. His expression shifted, and he had an unsettling look in his eyes. He didn't respond, We maintained eye contact as the tension escalated. Then, suddenly, I thrust my body into the door, pushing Xander back and revealing the motionless body in the corner of his room. He pushed me out and locked the door behind him, but I had already seen enough. In a panic, I rushed to grab my phone, left the house, and immediately called the police. Xander made no attempt to escape or hide, but tragically it was too late. The lifeless body had been in that state for several hours. The details surrounding the incident were not disclosed to me, but I learned that Xander had lied about his age, being nearly 30 years old. To this day, he remains incarcerated, yet he refuses to divulge the reasons behind his actions and the circumstances involving the body. I consider myself fortunate to have escaped the situation swiftly, because if I hadn't, who knows where I might be today.